j'ai du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma robe à fleurs, sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
After years of dodging House Democrats, President Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr finally agreed to appear to answer questions. It did take the threat of a subpoena from the Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, but the Attorney General finally came before the committee that oversees the Justice Department, and they had lots of questions for the man who is supposed to be the people's lawyer, but acts more like the president's personal fixer. As a result, there was no shortage of ground to cover at what turned out to be an often combative 5-hour grilling. Unsurprisingly, Barr was oftentimes evasive, at other times openly hostile to questioning from Democratic lawmakers.
Is it ever appropriate, sir, for the president to solicit or accept foreign assistance in an election?
It depends what kind of assistance.
Is it ever appropriate for the president or presidential candidate to accept or solicit foreign assistance of any kind in his or her election?
No, it's not appropriate.
Okay, sorry you had to struggle with that.
So first, there is a federal statute that makes it a crime to accept or solicit any assistance. So the congressman had it totally right. So the Attorney General's initial statement was just wrong. And you could see what was going on there was that he was caught because he knew what the evidence was with respect to the president and the evidence with respect to the impeachment, and he was trying to duck it. And so that doesn't really speak well for his taking the oath that he was under seriously. He eventually got to what was an obvious answer, which is no, you cannot accept or solicit any foreign assistance.
So as part of those conversations with the president or his people about the re-election campaign, have you ever discussed the current or future deployment of federal law enforcement?
In connection with what?
In connection with what you just said, in connection with your discussions with the president or with other people around him of his re-election campaign, have you discussed the current or future deployment of federal law enforcement?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to get into my discussions with the president, but I've made it clear that I would like to pick the cities based on law enforcement need and based on neutral criteria.
So, but you can't tell me whether you discussed...
No, I'm not going to discuss what I discussed with the president.
Can you commit today that the department will not use federal law enforcement as a prop in the president's re-election campaign?
We are not using
I just want to close with this thought. You really can't hide behind legal fictions this time, Mr. Barr. It's all out in the open, where the people can see what you are doing for themselves. The president wants footage for his campaign ads, and you appear to be serving it up to him as ordered. In most of these cities, the protests had begun to wind down before you marched in and confronted the protesters. And the protesters aren't mobs. They are mothers and veterans and mayors. In this moment, real leadership would entail de-escalation, collaboration, and looking for ways to peaceably resolve our differences. Instead, you use pepper spray and truncheons on American citizens.
Clearly, the Democrats' message, they wanted to have this message that Barr has been the enabler-in-chief for the president at the Justice Department. I think the message Barr wanted to have is on this question of the use of force in Portland, that the federal agents are not there to try to do anything with peaceful protests. It's the people who are violently attacking federal law enforcement officers, trying to set fire to the courthouse. That's why they're there. And his message seemed to be,
if the Portland police would just step up and help us, we could back off.
Is it your opinion, Mr. Barr, that clearing protesters from Lafayette Square, which local officials were told to hurry up moments before the president's photo op with a borrowed Bible in front of a church, was coincidence? Is this timing coincidence?
I believe it is, yes. As I said, I use the analogy of MacArthur at Leyte Golf.
We heard
okay.
that. Thank
yeah?
you. I'll repeat.
Okay, so...
Mr. Attorney General, we'll assume that was all coincidence. Interrelated.
I've already explained that it had been planned all day.
Attorney General, the time is mine. We've waited a long time for you to come here. The time is mine.
You've waited to talk to me like this? You didn't need to wait so long.
When asked about...
He not only lied, he doubled back. He did a backflip. I quoted him where he said it was not chemical, the pepper balls used against peaceful protesters, and we've spoken to many of them. This was a peaceful protest. If there was any kind of rioting, of course, this is not the way you would deal with rioting. This was peaceful protest. That's what everybody has said. What the Attorney General did was he said, yes, it was not chemical. No, it was chemical. I didn't mean that. He did a double backflip. He used pepper ball agents against peaceful protesters. And what I showed him was that the beauty of pepper balls is not only the chemical irritant, but the blunt force trauma. That's what he directed when he stood in that square at 6:10 and said, get it done. And there's no coincidence between the president finishing a law and order statement in the Rose Garden and walking across. What I compare him to, the Attorney General worked as an advance man on the campaign. Can you imagine the Secret Service would have thought there's some disturbance in Lafayette Square? The last thing we want is for the president to walk out the front door of the White House and across the square. This was an advance man for a political campaign, for a photo op with, as I said, a borrowed Bible.
The Department of Justice issued a statement saying that Mr. Berman, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, had, quote, stepped down. You're aware of that statement being released by the department, correct?
Yes.
And do you testify today that that statement was true at the time the department issued it?
He may not have known it, but he was stepping down.
He may not have known that he was stepping down. That's your testimony today?
He was being removed.
Mr. Attorney General, the statement did not say that he was being removed. It did not say that he was being fired. It said that he was stepping down.
There's an old joke that says, how do you know when a lawyer is lying? Because his mouth is moving. I think that is so appropriate to William Barr. He engages in such doublespeak, and that exchange really demonstrates how he does that. He issued a press release that said that Jeffrey Berman was stepping down. It turns out that, in fact, he didn't know it, and there was no communication about that. And he still persists in that. Instead of admitting that he was caught in the lie, he said, well, he was stepping down. He just didn't know it yet. He didn't know that he had been pushed. Same thing with regard to the use of tear gas in Lafayette Square. He says there was no tear gas used. Well, he fails to mention that there was pepper spray used, which is also a chemical irritant. And so he is very careful in the words he chooses to make them literally true, but figuratively false.
It is Wednesday, the 29th of July of 2020, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner, the English bulldog, is our snoozing sous chef. And our daily special is Smothered Benedict Wednesdays, a lovely egg dish with an equally lovely and very velvety hollandaise sauce. Yes. And also, let's rid ourselves of these meddlesome priests. Yeah, wherever they are. Especially the ones that are saying, oh yeah, alien sperm is infecting our DNA and turning lizard people into lizard people. Well, you know, a clock is right twice a day, isn't it? Okay, well, you know, there are lizard people in government. Everybody knows that. Just look at them. But all this other stuff, oh my God. And Trump said that he saw her on TV, so what she says must be true. Oh, boy. And Jonathan Swan got the, I believe, got the scoop of the day. If not the week, even though the week's only half over. Yeah, Jonathan Swan of Axios fame sat down with Trump And Trump said, Vlad and I didn't talk about Russian bounties on our soldiers' heads. We had more important things to talk about. Oh, really? You mean like our troops being withdrawn from Germany in the hopes that it will speed up the breaking up of NATO? You want to break up NATO? Is that what you were talking about? And then Trump went off on a slew of Russian talking points. Of course, in the midst of it, says, everybody talks about Russia, Russia, Russia. Why don't you talk about China? Well, we do. We do. But you have a much more, shall we say, intimate relationship with Vlad. Not so intimate with China, shall we put it that way? And I wonder why. We know why. It has to do with some sort of racial thing. So, Trump is out there pushing the bleach again. This is what happens when you get a new campaign manager just, months before the election. Go back out there and start using your old talking points. Okay. So, did not talk about bounties on our soldiers' heads. Because Trump said that a lot of people were calling it fake news, but not your intelligence services. They brought you the information. Vlad said, that's fake. I wouldn't do that. And Trump believes him because he owes. Yeah, lock, stock, and barrel. And a lot of barrels, too, because Trump, we're talking about gun barrels here. Trump also confessed that we've given him a bunch of weapons, too, to kill our soldiers with. How nice. How very, very nice. And Trump thinks because the Soviet Union was dismantled, essentially, because they poured all of their money into Afghanistan. And so now Russia, I love how Trump gives Jonathan Swan a history lesson. Like we don't know how Russia came about after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Trump has had to remind Jonathan Swan, you may not know this, but this is how Russia became Russia. Really? Anyway, Trump thinks that, Russia won't go back into Afghanistan because of, what happened back during the Carter years. They're not going back into Afghanistan. They're making sure that we spend a lot of our money there, though. And breaking up NATO, take our troops out of Germany, which is, like part of a NATO sort of thing. And just talk up Russia and blame it on China. Mm-hmm. His Chinese virus. He keeps calling it the Chinese virus. My God. Talk about a racist. It's COVID-19. Just call it COVID-19. Stop trying to blame. If you want to blame anybody, we better start blaming us. Americans can't go anywhere in the world because of our inability to tackle this pandemic. I'm getting a spam amount of information about how Sweden, the mortality rate in Sweden has just dropped. And they didn't have any kind of restrictions. Nobody wore masks. Nobody washed their hands. Nobody socially distanced. Bull pucky. They did. In fact, Sweden closed schools for kids above 15. And people that are around our age, yeah, I know listeners listen here are a bunch of boomers. Sorry, but boomers our age were encouraged to self-isolate, especially if you had symptoms. And so the reason that Sweden has the numbers that they have is because their populace said, you know what, this is real. We better on our own self-isolate and do the things we need to do because we don't need the government to tell us what to do. We know what to do and we will do it. The right wing of this country looks at Sweden as if, they're just a bunch of libertarians. They're just doing anything they want. They went out drinking and that is not true. Their population were actually responsible. Our population is not. And that's why we have the numbers that we have, in spite of mandates. Do you think people are just going to go on their own to be good neighbors? The whole argument against PC culture is the right wing cannot be forced to be a good neighbor. You can't force me to be a good neighbor. No way. And I've got a gun to make sure it never happens. And they do. So, the reason we have laws is because people won't on their own do the right thing. Lots of us will, but there's going to be a bunch that don't, and they're going to make life miserable for the rest of us. And never let us forget it either. Ever. Oh, Bill Barr testified in front of the House yesterday. Did you hear? God, I hate that guy. There's something about Bill Barr, just the smug attitude of this craven individual. Well, John Mitchell was sent to jail for perjury. And Bill Barr could be John Mitchell and should be now more than ever. I keep saying it. Because that contentious hearing that he was involved in was a case study in dissembling, defensiveness, and partisanship. Bill Barr is Donald Trump's concierge. He's Trump's Tom Hagen. And the sooner that we accept that reality, the sooner we can get to work to John Mitchell, Bill Barr, now more than ever. What's on the rest of the menu here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy? Well, U.S. mayors decry the lack of new funding for cities in the Senate Republican bill. Yeah, who cares about cities? The American Civil Liberties Union asked a federal court to sanction individual members of Trump's SA Gestapo for targeting journalists at the Portland protests in violation of the court's order. They don't care about the law. Well, they do. They make up the law, and they determine how it will be ordered. And it's usually with truncheons. And a black West Virginia man filed a federal lawsuit against a police chief and 2 white officers accused of pulling him from his home and severely beating him. Why? Because they can. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where the University of Hong Kong sacked a veteran pro-democracy activist from his tenured position as an associate professor of law. So much for academic freedom. And scientists are poring over a surprisingly well-preserved woolly mammoth skeleton found in a lake in Russia's Arctic. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. Bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com. To the leftish of the page is our chat room link, monitored by Kelly Lincoln, of course. Thank you, Kelly. To the leftish of the chat room link that just happens to be near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, you will then notice the link to our Patreon page. And if you could pledge a monthly pledge, become a Patreon of Netroots Radio. If you could afford an espresso-type coffee drink, say, and send those funds to us once a month, we will stretch those dollars, we will pay our bills, and we will continue resisting as the founders originally intended. We thank those who have been so generous over all these many years, going on 10, by the way, of 24/7, 365 Resistance Radio, continuous broadcasting. And thank you for your generosity over those many years. And we need a few more of you. We do indeed. I know it's perilous times, but if you could afford to buy Netroots Radio an espresso or a latte and just send those funds our way, we will fulfill our civic duty, and we will be forever grateful for your generosity in allowing us to do so. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, do so at Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of that, and thank you, Tom. I, of course, take care of at Justice Putnam on Twitter, and you can go ahead and follow me there. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Kos about 10 minutes before showtime and get that linked up on social media, and guess what? Twitter is part of that. Wow. Follow the show on Twitter at Cookbook West and pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, and wherever podcasts can be found, because they're everywhere. Everywhere. Okay. I'm getting somewhat conflicting reports on Portland. Apparently, the feds are pulling out of Seattle. And I heard the feds are at least in negotiations with Portland to pull out, but I also heard that they're going to send in some more troops. I love that, troops. But it looks like maybe cooler heads are prevailing and the feds are actually going to pull out because their presence has not only escalated it, they have escalated themselves by their own actions. What's up? I saw this video in New York of these cops coming up in an unmarked van. I presume they're cops. And they take down like a 14-year-old girl, a young girl, and hustle her into this unmarked van, and it looked like kidnapping, because it was. But what was their excuse for taking down 5 guys? Just beat the crap out of her and hauled her away. And what was her great crime? Through surveillance, their fusion center intel, they found out she had tagged a building. She put some graffiti on a building. Oh my God, she's a state terrorist. Now, during Barr's hearing yesterday, Paul brought up Michigan. Barr says, I never heard of that. You never heard on several occasions, not just 2, but several occasions, when Trump said, liberate Michigan, armed right-wing Trump maggots invaded the state house, occupied it with armed weapons, screamed in cops' faces. The cops retreated, and then these terrorists called for the beheading of the governor, the elected governor. Barr, I didn't hear anything about that. But they can take down a 14, 17-year-old girl for graffiti? They heard about that. But they didn't hear about the right-wing maggots calling for the beheading of an elected official of the United States while occupying a state house with armed troops. Nothing. But yeah, let's send in the SA Gestapo into Portland and Seattle and Kansas City and Chicago and wherever. Because how dare these anarchists try to defund the police? Defund the police. Give me a break. They ought to have all their military weaponry taken away. If that's what they mean by defunding, I'm all for that. I'm all for a purge of our law enforcement. Maybe they ought to start taking some personality tests, let alone just the regular, background checks. Have you ever been involved in right-wing activities in which you, bullied and harassed another individual by the color of their skin? If that ever comes up, yes, they don't get to be a cop. Let alone, have you abused animals? Abused animals, don't be a cop. It's only a short step then from beating on their moms, their wives, any woman that they can find, like a 14-year-old girl. Tagged a building, got to take her down. Yeah, can't be a cop. Any cop who says, I am not going to show up when you call the police department and say you've been raped. Any cop says that, they don't get to be a cop. Anywhere. They should be blackballed. Indeed. Okay, let's dive into this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Smothered Benedict Wednesdays, by the way. And it comes out of Reuters And it looks like anonymous worker bees have penned this, but let me scroll down to the bottom. Oh, here we go. Reporting by Karen Pirogue. Sometimes they put the byline all the way on the bottom, so it's more like the bottom line. Wow. Mayors of U.S. cities blasted a $1 trillion Senate Republican coronavirus relief bill for not addressing the needs of cities, which are crippled by drastically dwindling resources as coronavirus cases spike in parts of the nation. Trump went on yesterday and said, oh, yeah, there's no coronavirus in like broad swaths of America. Sorry, but it's everywhere. And we'll give the weather report since coronavirus cases are now part of the weather, at least the reportage of. And yes, we've had another tremendously large spike for our tiny county in terms of population. Large in terms of geography, small in terms of population. Pretty soon, we keep hearing like 1 in 6 people are sick from coronavirus. Okay, it's going to catch up with everybody. Mayor Nan Whaley of Dayton, Ohio, said the bill dramatically missed the mark for cities which are dealing with big budget holes and sinking economies while being on the front line of the virus battle. Whaley, who was among mayors who spoke with reporters on a conference call sponsored by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, those anarchist organizations. And they called for a real national strategy that would give cities direct and flexible funding. These anarchists are always looking to the feds to solve everything. Damn anarchists. Whether Democratic, Republican, or Independent, coastal or inland, everyone is struggling to meet the needs of residents and fight this pandemic with drastically dwindling resources, Whaley said. The bill, unveiled by Moscow Mitch McConnell, does not include any new money for fiscally ailing states and local governments whose revenues have been hit by plunging sales tax and income tax collection. The bill, which Democrats have criticized as inadequate, would allow the governments to replace lost revenue with a slice of the $150 billion earmarked for their coronavirus expenses under the CARES Act, which was enacted in March. Only 25% of the money would be eligible and could not be used to fund pensions or other retirement benefits or to replenish rainy day funds. The mayor said CARES Act money went directly to states and has not, for the most part, trickled down to cities because they're not allowed. It's only for population centers of a certain amount. I think, 30, 100,000? Yeah, my little town has 2,500 people. Van Johnson, the mayor of Savannah, Georgia, said new robust funding was needed to stave off economic ruin. Flexibility for previously allocated CARES Act funding is just a drop in the bucket. We are looking for a full pail of water, he said. The $3 trillion HEROES Act, passed by the Democratic-controlled U.S. House in May, allocated $500 billion to states and $375 billion to cities and counties. Exactly what you would expect an anarchist to do. Before we dive into this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Smothered Benedict Wednesdays, I wanted to mention that our little village of Rogue River made the news yesterday. Now, Rogue River is full of pandemic denialists, and it shows when people are just so brazen when they go around not wearing masks, and then looking rather surly when you look at them as if you might mention that they're not wearing a mask. And when I say surly, I mean they're packing guns on their hips. Well, they'll wear a gun, but they won't wear a mask. Anyway, the school superintendent here was on the news because the schools are going to open because that's what people in Rogue River want. Okay. And I guess they did a survey of the teachers, and yeah, it's just important that we have all the kids in a room and everybody can get COVID. Like I said, when the weather report comes up during the break, after the break, we'll get into some increased COVID numbers. This next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is also out of Reuters by Mark Hosenball. U.S. civil liberty advocates asked a federal court in Portland, Oregon to hold federal agents in contempt for violating a temporary court order barring attacks on journalists and legal observers monitoring protests in the city. Only temporary? Should that be like all the time permanent? Before, during, and after any of this? I don't know. The filing by the ACLU came during a wave of protests against police violence and racism in Portland, in which federal agents have clashed with protesters who have lit fires and thrown objects at the federal courthouse. The ACLU Foundation of Oregon on July 23rd obtained an order from the U.S. District Court in Portland barring attacks on journalists and observers covering the demonstrations. Now, when we talk about attacks on journalists, what are we talking about exactly? We're talking about sniper fire hitting them in the eye when they're photojournalists. Linda Tirado had that happen, not in Portland, but one of the towns in the Midwest. I'm so sorry I forget. Yeah, Linda Tirado, friend of Netroots Radio, been on the show. Well, been on a couple of shows from a few years ago. And she was shot in the eye. Direct hit. They're aiming for the head. Why is that? Now remember, a less than lethal round is when the round bounces off the pavement first. That is how they are trained to use these rounds. When you shoot them straight onto someone, the blunt force trauma makes it now a potentially lethal weapon. Not less than lethal, but potentially lethal. These violations are not inadvertent, lawyers for the ACLU argued. The ACLU, acting on behalf of the alternative Portland Mercury newspaper and 10 individual plaintiffs, include journalists and legal activists, said federal law enforcement officers in Portland violated the terms of that restraining order. And once again, those violations are not inadvertent. They are intentional acts by a lawless president who sent his paramilitary forces to shoot up the streets of Portland, choke downtown in a haze of toxic chemical fumes, and generate re-election sound bites, the filing said, referring to Donald Trump, who ordered the deployment. The ACLU said that videos, photographs, and witness accounts showed that federal officers shot 3 people clearly identified as legal observers in the head, neck, and chest with non-lethal rounds such as beanbags or rubber bullets. The ACLU said government agents also purposefully tear-gassed and dispersed journalists in violation of the court order. The ACLU asked the court to order that federal officers identified as attackers be named, ordered to appear in court, and banned from participating in any future armed operations in Oregon. I would say strip them of their badges, and if they're not really law enforcement, but they're hired contract goons from militias or from Eric Prince's Blackwater, then maybe civil actions in which their largesse, their wages, will be attached and garnished, possibly. How about that? The Department of Homeland Security had no immediate comment. U.S. Attorney General William Barr defended the actions of federal agents in Portland, saying they were protecting the courthouse, except they went 4 blocks away from the courthouse to beat up journalists, beat up moms, and crack a few heads of 17-year-old girls. Anonymous worker bees at the Associated Press bring us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. A black West Virginia man has filed a federal lawsuit against a police chief and 2 white officers accused of pulling him from his home, beating him, fracturing facial bones, and causing other serious injuries, according to the suit. The lawsuit, brought by Andre Houghton this month in U.S. District Court in the Northern District of West Virginia, names Westover Police Chief Richard Panico and officers Zachary Fexo and Aaron Dalton. Fexco is accused of violating Houghton's civil rights by unlawfully seizing and using excessive force against him, while Dalton is accused of failing to intervene, among other allegations against the two. The lawsuit said Panico hired the officers despite previous records of violence. The lawsuit alleged Fexco struck Houghton more than 13 times after responding to Houghton's home to help remove a woman from the residence on New Year's Day in 2019. According to the lawsuit, Fexco also called Houghton boy because of his race and then assaulted him, while Dalton encouraged the beating. The 22-minute encounter was captured on Dalton's body camera. The two later denied Houghton aid for his injuries, the lawsuit alleged. Dalton used to work for the Fairmont Police Department, but resigned after his involvement in the beating of a handcuffed man, and Fexco had previously been charged with domestic battery after a violent encounter with an ex-girlfriend. Chief Panico said the department would not comment on the lawsuit, citing a pending investigation into Houghton that is not related to previous charges against him that were dropped in the 2019 case. All right, we better get on with our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You were listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. This week, The Moss Show. In the new movie Shirley, Elizabeth Moss takes on the title, if not leading role, in a loose biopic about the 1950s horror writer Shirley Jackson, based on Susan Merrill's novel Shirley. As the movie begins, young academic Fred Nemser and his wife Rose roll up on their new assignment at Bennington College in Vermont, expecting to stay a few days with his supervising professor, Stanley, and his writer wife Shirley. The Nemsers are prevailed upon to stay on a bit to help with Shirley, whose problems only start with being agoraphobic. Shirley is brilliant and acerbic, insightful and mercurial, and wrecked that she is beginning work on a novel that we know will become 1951's Hangs a Man, about a Bennington student named Paula who had gone missing prior. Director Josephine Decker, who gave us Madeline's Madeline in 2018, focuses on the relationship between Shirley and Rose, who in Shirley's mind at its most twisted is commingled with the missing Paula from her work. We see conflict and camaraderie, a competition of wits, and the mutual struggle of being a woman, let alone an artist, in 50s academia. Along with this dynamic, we have that of Shirley and husband Stanley, played by a delightfully prickish Michael Stuhlbarg. This relationship brings to mind one from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Fred, whose character is underexplored, is at once dominated by Stanley and in awe of him, watching as his mentor mingles amongst the co-eds and faculty. Decker's contrast of the claustrophobic and panoramic and use of handheld close-ups that seem almost wired to Shirley's mind make Shirley as frenetic a ride as you'll ever see for what's more of a character study than a story. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. Catch up with us at take2moviereview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Suzanne Bard. Peter Bruegel's iconic 1565 painting, The Harvesters, hangs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The work depicts peasants cutting stalks of wheat nearly as tall as they are.
Nowadays, if you walk through a wheat field, you basically see that wheat is about knee height. The short stature is essentially a consequence of breeding from the second half of the 20th century.
University of Ghent biologist Yves de Smet. Selective breeding favored genes for reduced height because they came along with genes for increasing yields to feed a growing population. De Smet says wheat is just one example of how historical artwork can allow us to track the transformation of food crops over time. He teamed up with art historian David Frahauen of Amarant to catalog such artwork from around the world.
We have been mainly looking at things where we can spot changes in shape, in color, in size.
Friends since childhood, their interest in plants and artwork began with a visit to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, where they noticed an odd-looking watermelon in an early 17th century painting by Flemish artist Franz Snijders.
So if you think of a watermelon, you cut it through, it should be dark red on the inside, but that one appeared to be pale and white.
Biologist de Smet assumed the painter had done a poor job, but art historian Frahauen had a different idea.
And he says, no, this is one of the best painters ever from that era, so if he paints it like that, that's the way it must have looked like.
Other paintings revealed that both red and white watermelons were cultivated during the 17th century. The color is determined by a gene that controls the pigment lycopene.
There must have been some sort of mutation preventing the accumulation of that color. Now, with all the genetic knowledge that we have from various plant species, we can look in more detail how something comes about.
For example, de Smet says carrots first started to be depicted as orange only in the 16th century, thanks to selective breeding for the beta-carotene pigment. And until the 18th century, European strawberries appeared tiny in paintings. They then grew in size with the advent of crossbreeding with North American varieties. The research is in the journal Trends in Plant Science. Ultimately, the team hopes to create an online research database of historical plant artwork. They seek the contributions of art enthusiasts around the world via the social media hashtag ArtGenetics. But they caution, the source paintings need to be realistic.
If you're going to use, for example, Picasso to try and understand how a pear looked in the early 20th century, you might be misled.
Indeed, such an attempt could be fruitless. Thanks for listening. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Suzanne Bard.
This program is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Colorectal cancer is the number 2 cancer killer of men and women in the United States, but it is preventable. Early on, colorectal cancer typically has no symptoms. It starts with a precancerous polyp or abnormal growth in the colon, which can be removed without surgery. Several tests are available to find these polyps, so they can be removed before they turn into cancer. Screening also finds colorectal cancer early when treatment works best. Recommended screening for adults at average risk begins at age 50 and continues until age 75. Learn about screening test options and find out which tests are covered by insurance. Talk to your healthcare provider about when you should be screened and discuss the best tests for you. For more information about colorectal cancer prevention, please visit cdc.gov/vital signs.
For the most accurate health information, visit cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, Show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
President Donald Trump is deploying federal law enforcement troops to Portland, Albuquerque, Kansas City, and he says Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and other major cities are on his list as well. I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. Those federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, and the U.S. Marshals Service, thousands of them, are being deployed over the objection of mayors of those cities and the governors of those states. Tom Ridge, the country's first director of the Department of Homeland Security, who served under President George W. Bush, warned that DHS, quote, was not established to be the president's personal militia. It would be a cold day in hell before I would give consent to a unilateral, uninvited intervention into any one of those cities, he said. But Trump's acting director of DHS, Chad Wolf, says, I don't need invitations by the state mayors or its state governors to do our job. We're going to do that whether they like us there or not. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot said that she would welcome a partnership with federal law enforcement, but added, we do not welcome dictatorship, authoritarianism, or unconstitutional arrests and detainment of our residents. The protests continue, and multiple lawsuits have been filed against the federal actions. How this maelstrom plays out in the courts and in our political institutions will determine a lot about the future of freedom in America. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU, because freedom can't protect itself.
Welcome to 60 Second Civics, the daily podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, outlawed slavery or involuntary servitude throughout the United States and its territories, thereby finishing the work begun by President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 to 63. The Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery in the states that were members of the Confederacy, but not elsewhere. The 13th Amendment said nothing about citizenship and equal civil rights for the former slaves, especially their right to vote. These matters were later taken up by the 14th Amendment in 1868 and the 15th Amendment in 1870. The 14th Amendment granted full citizenship to African Americans. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to men regardless of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's all for today's podcast, 60 Second Civics, where civic education only takes a minute.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. This day in labor history, the year was 1956. That was the day that an oil tank explosion took the lives of 19 men fighting a fire at the Shamrock Oil and Gas Company in the northeast of Dumas, Texas. Dumas was in the Texas Panhandle, oil boom country. The day after the tragedy, the Chicago Daily Tribune carried the story of what happened. 4 huge petroleum tanks exploded today, bathing 19 men in a super hot wall of flame and killing them in their tracks. The towering orange fireball of the first explosion was sighted in Amarillo, 40 miles away. The events that triggered the explosion started when a flammable gas caught flame and flared into a small ground fire at Shamrock. Employees and volunteer firefighters tried to stop the blaze, but despite their effort, the fire grew. Just before 7 in the morning, a 12,000-barrel tank exploded. This ignited another 20,000-barrel tank, and then 2 more. 15 of those fighting the fire died instantly. 4 others later succumbed to their burns. Many more were injured. A news editor on the scene described what he saw, writing, quote, "A bright orange mushroom boiled up, floating in heavy black smoke, and I prayed that those firefighters would get out alive, but some didn't. 8 who died were Shamrock employees. The other 11 were volunteer firefighters. Today, a memorial bearing their names pays tribute to those who died. An inscription reads, quote, "But whether on the plains so high or in the battle's van, the fittest place where man can die is where he dies for man." In 2015, 68 firefighters died while on the job protecting people and property throughout the United States. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. We always begin, whether from around the world, along the banks of the Rogue River, in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon, on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 68 degrees Fahrenheit, looking to be nearly the same temperature as yesterday, which was about 103. And we'll have plenty of sunshine. Winds out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Overnight lows will be in the upper 60s to low 70s. Quite warm, wouldn't you say? Clear skies will prevail. Winds will be out of the north-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. And then tomorrow we'll have mainly sunny skies, high around 102. Winds out of the northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Confirmed coronavirus cases in Jackson County of Southern Oregon have now increased to 312. 269 yesterday, 312 today. So much for a hoax. You know, this is such a hoax virus that Herman Cain has been in the hospital for 3 weeks on oxygen. That's really how much of a hoax it is. Kind of makes you wonder how many other people from that Tulsa rally are still in the hospital from a hoax virus. Okay, grass pollen right outside the window here at the mothership is rated at moderate. That air quality index is moderate at 56 parts per million, and the daytime UV index is still very high, though it has dropped down from 9 to 8. Still dangerous conditions. Slather on the SPF 50. Do it. Barometric pressure is rising at 29.87 inches. Visibility is up to 10 miles. And relative humidity is at 71%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property. And these people positively live around the world. London is 74 degrees and fair. Paris is 80 degrees and sunny. Rome is 94 and sunny with a heat advisory that may impact critical electrical infrastructure. Kyiv is 90 degrees and fair. Kabul is 85 and fair. Hong Kong is 80 degrees and partly cloudy. Tokyo is 74 and cloudy. Sydney, Australia is 55 degrees and clear. San Francisco, California is 55 degrees and cloudy with a fog advisory that should lift off around noontime. And New York is 87 degrees Fahrenheit and partly cloudy. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property. And these people positively live around the world. Anonymous worker bees at Reuters bring us this first amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. The University of Hong Kong sacked veteran pro-democracy activist Benny Tai from his tenured position as an associate professor of law, a move he called the end of academic freedom in the Chinese-ruled city. Tai was a leading figure in Hong Kong's 2014 umbrella protests, which paralyzed the city for 79 days as demonstrators occupied main roads demanding greater democracy. What an anarchist. He was sentenced to 16 months in prison last year for 2 public nuisance offenses, but was released on bail pending an appeal. And that conviction prompted Hong Kong University to begin reviewing his position. The decision by the governing council reversed an earlier one by the university senate that there were not enough grounds for a dismissal. It marks the end of academic freedom in Hong Kong, Tai said. Academic institutions in Hong Kong cannot protect their members from internal and outside interferences. Tai was also singled out by Beijing officials this month for his role in helping organize an unofficial primary vote for the opposition pro-democracy camp to select candidates for elections to the city legislature. The official said the vote was illegal and potentially violated a new sweeping national security law that many fear will erode freedoms in the semi-autonomous city, including those of media and academia. In a statement, the Hong Kong Liaison Office, Beijing's main representation in the city, said Tai's sacking was just an act of punishing evil, promoting good, and conforming to the people's will. They said Tai's words and deeds have severely intensified social conflicts in Hong Kong and poisoned Hong Kong's political environment. Yeah, democracy will do that. Hong Kong University said in a statement that its council had resolved the personnel issue following a lengthy, stringent, and impartial process without naming Tai. Of course, the university could not be reached for comment.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes, quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Even more anonymous worker bees at Reuters bring us this final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Russian scientists are poring over the stunningly well-preserved bones of an adult woolly mammoth that roamed the earth at least 10,000 years ago after local inhabitants discovered its remains in the shallows of a North Siberian lake. Part of its skull, several ribs and foreleg bones, some with the soft tissue still attached, were retrieved from Russia's remote Yamal Peninsula above the Arctic Circle on July 23rd. Scientists are still searching the site for other bones. Similar finds in Russia's vast Siberian region have happened with increasing regularity as climate change warming in the Arctic at a faster pace than the rest of the world has thawed the ground in some areas long locked in permafrost. Scientists circulated images in December of a prehistoric puppy thought to be about 18,000 years old that was found in the permafrost region of Russia's Far East in 2018. The mammoth remains are at least 10,000 years old, although researchers don't yet know exactly when it walked the earth or how old it was when it died. Researchers have found mammoth fossils dating from up to 30,000 years ago in Russia. A scientist from a local museum said it was unusual to find so many bones belonging to a single species and to know where they came from. Of course, we'd like to find the remaining parts to understand how complete a find it is. Whenever there is soft tissue left behind, it is valuable material to study, she said. Indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, and you know we'll meet up tomorrow for Metro Shrimp and Grits Thursdays. So stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we'll meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appétit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. À fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair. T'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.